Thank you, everyone, for coming to this presentation. I am Jeremy Parish. I am co-host of the Retronauts podcast, media curator at Limited Run Games, and I am here in my capacity as a person who makes YouTube videos to talk about Sega's 8-bit evolution, or Sega's 8-bit history if you read the sign outside. Either Journey, that's what it was. Either way, it's talking about a facet of Sega's history that doesn't really get a lot of coverage and discussion. I think if you are an American, you probably mostly have fond memories of Sega from the Sega Genesis, 16-bit era and beyond, or maybe from the arcade in the late 80s and beyond, where they were making superscalar games, or the Virtua series. But Sega has a really rich history that predates all of that even the company doesn't really embrace all that. Sometimes they'll offer nods to the Master System. And of course, if you are from Europe or from Brazil, you probably love the Master System very, very much. If you are not, then you probably, maybe you were the weird kid in your class who owned one. But mostly, there you go, thank you, sir. But mostly people here during the 8-bit era owned NES games. And maybe you have some memories of seeing some of these 8-bit arcade games out there in the wild back in the day. But again, for the most part, Sega is largely kind of thought of as 16-bit and beyond. Sonic and Golden Axe and Thunder Force and things like that, Thunder Blade. And the company kind of begins chronicling its own history a lot of times when you kind of look and read about their stuff. Really with the beginning of the superscalar arcade hardware, 1985 with Hang-On. That's really kind of what they see as their true beginning, in a sense. But I'm actually here to talk about all the things that came before that. And it turns out there's a lot. Sega's really unique among video game hardware makers in that they're one of the very few companies that came into the console business from an arcade background. Obviously Atari did also, but unlike Atari, which came into existence in order to create arcade games and then kind of rolled on into consoles and television systems, Sega started back in the 1940s, working just in general electronics. They would take, the company that kind of became Sega would take machines like, let's see, what do we have here? Slot machines and other coin-operated amusements from the US and import them into Japan and refurbish them. And then, after a while, they started making their own machines, such as the Lord Sega slot machine that you see here. In 1968, 69, they created a game called Duck Hunt, where you had to shoot ducks that would fly out of the grass and a dog was there. Totally a coincidence, I'm sure, that Nintendo created something very similar a few years later. But yeah, if you look back, most other video game manufacturers got into the console business as toy makers. You have like Mattel, or you have Coleco, which started as a leather making company. Not a lot of companies went from arcade to console the way Sega did. And Sega is also unique in that they created consoles in the 80s, but they didn't create anything before their first game system, the SG-1000. They didn't create any dedicated Pong systems the way that Nintendo and Atari and Epoch did. So they just kind of went straight from coin-op amusements into console games. And I think that transition, that evolution, that very sudden jump, really informed the kind of work that they did and the kind of games that they created and the kind of experiences that they wanted people to have. They always kind of had that arcade mentality. I don't know that they do so much anymore, but throughout the Genesis and Saturn and Dreamcast years and beyond, they really kind of embraced the idea of creating impressive, like visually stunning experiences that were very kind of direct and intuitive and often very challenging. And that really set them apart from a lot of the competition. I mean, Nintendo was definitely the opposite. They made some tough games sometimes, but theirs were much more games that you would spend some time with, you'd chew on. They had an easier difficulty level. They weren't necessarily so much about seeing how far you could get on a single credit. They were, The Legend of Zelda or Metroid, where it was about, here's a huge world, explore it, enjoy. SEGA did some of those, but for the most part, they were there to just, humble you and test your skills and see how well you could do. And so what I want to do with this panel is not to really talk about their 8-bit consoles. We'll talk about that if we have time, but really to look at the arcade games and the arcade history that led up to the SG-1000 and the Master System and the Genesis. Because all the work that they did, starting in 1976, when they released their first 8-bit video game in arcades, that really all fed into what they created and became known for in the late 80s and the 90s with things like Outrun and Galaxy Force and Virtua Cop and Virtua Fighter. Without the arcade games we're looking at here and the specific hardware platforms they created, we never would have gotten those games. So the very first hardware we're talking about with SEGA is the BLOCKADE hardware. This is BLOCKADE. You probably know it as Snake or Surround, but SEGA published it under the name BLOCKADE. And this hardware was actually created by Gremlin, a company based in San Diego. And SEGA and Gremlin became good friends. They would basically join together after a few years. And if you remember arcade games from the early 80s, if they were a SEGA game, it probably had the name Gremlin on it. And that's because they kind of used Gremlin as both as a development house for technology and also for publishing and distribution in the US. And so their very first entry into 8-bit video game hardware was with the BLOCKADE platform, which is very, very simple. As you can see, it was single color, just very simple noises, kind of irritating noises, very limiting gameplay. But it was a step for them. Before that, they'd only created dedicated hardware systems with transistor logic, where that was kind of the way of things in the early 70s into the late 70s. For most arcade makers, they would sit down and they would create a circuit board from start to finish that would create a single game, and that required a lot of engineering as opposed to necessarily game design. Not to say that those early games didn't have design involved, but usually games were designed by the engineers, and they were kind of solving problems. Whereas once you switched over to microprocessor-based systems, such as the BLOCKADE hardware, it became about programming, and the idea of art and design started to have more space. It was easier for people to create more involved, more complex, more elaborate games, because they didn't have to build the arcade hardware from scratch every single time. So after the success, I guess, of the first few BLOCKADE-based games, SEGA and Gremlin got together and collaborated to create something called the VIC Dual hardware. I forgot to write down what VIC means, but the Dual got its name from the fact that these arcade cabinets could have 2 games in them. It was kind of an interchangeable system as a sort of predecessor to the Nintendo Versus system or the Data East Deco system or SNK's, I think, MICOM system, where basically you had a piece of hardware and SNK's Neo Geo. You could take out the game and plug in a new one without having to buy an entirely new cabinet. And this was still pretty simple hardware, but it did grow over time as they adapted it and upgraded it. So this here is a game called Frog, or Frogs, and some people credit this as the first platform video game. I think that might be stretching it. But you can kind of see the limitations of and the capabilities of the VIC Dual hardware here. The only actual game objects being generated by the hardware are the frog, the butterflies, and the score. Everything else, including the spaces that you jump across, are just a screen overlay, an animation. So that really nice looking swamp in the background, that is not being generated by the VIC Dual hardware. And I remember playing this game in a very early emulated state, and it was just a frog moving around in the inky blackness of space. And it was very difficult to play that way because you couldn't tell when you were going to fall in the pond. But this was a start, and by the end of the VIC Dual's lifetime, they started to create multicolor games and games with complex scrolling. This right here is Head On, which is a game that I think Sega fans have probably heard of, maybe experienced in some capacity. This was really considered one of the first maze chase games, although it's not really a chase so much as trying to avoid running into another car that really, really has it out for you. But you want to drive through these concentric rings and collect all the dots. This was 2 years before Pac-Man. And once you've completed that, you move along to a more difficult stage. And this game has been remade and resurfaced many times. It was licensed to a lot of different companies. Nintendo licensed it for a game called Head-On In. It was licensed by Tecmo for release on Game Boy 10 years later. And Sega remade it as a game called, oh wow, I just totally blanked out on what it was called. But it was the default ROM. What was that? No, not Snail Maze. It came with Astro City, their interchangeable arcade cabinets. There was apparently a law in Japan where you couldn't just sell an empty arcade cabinet. You had to sell a game inside. So they sat down and they built this very, very cheap recreation of Head-On. And so that was the default game that came with every Astro City. So when they published the Astro City Mini a few years ago, they included that game, whose name sadly escapes me.
I think on the Astro City Mini it just says it's called built-in.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it was, but the Astro City was all about interchanging the hardware. So you could take this out, and as a result, this hardware board is actually kind of hard to find because arcade owners would buy their Astro City cabinet and say, well, obviously I'm not going to put this out on the floor when people want to play Galaxy Force. So they would just toss these boards out. But they do exist, and Sega continues to to kind of commemorate its existence, which is nice. This is another game. It's called Digger, but if you are familiar with my channel, then you probably know it by its original name, Heiankyo Alien. They actually teamed up Sega with Tokyo Science Group and what was the name of the company? Whatever company actually published this, Denki Onkyo, and took that classic pre-Pac-Man dig 'em up maze game and put it out in arcades on the Vic Dual hardware. So that's kind of a momentous piece of history right there. The Vic Dual is not something that is a household name for Sega fans, but so much of Sega's history kind of ties back to that, and really this was a big entree for them into the arcade space and made them kind of competitive. The next piece of hardware, here's another one, Carnival. This was also on the Vic Dual hardware. If you have ever owned a ColecoVision, you probably had this game and remember the ducks flying down to attack you. So another momentous step for Sega, which was not hardware they created, but kind of put them in line with the rest of the video game arcade industry in the very late 70s and early 80s, was the GALAXIAN clone hardware. GALAXIAN, of course, was Namco's big breakout hit shooter from 1979, color, basically, version of Space Invaders, where the invaders didn't all descend en masse, but instead they would just kind of hover at the top and then send one or two little guys down to get you. That piece of hardware was very, very important in video game history. One, it was one of the first pieces of arcade hardware that supported color graphics. Arcade games were actually pretty late into the color space. There were color arcade games before GALAXIAN, but it was one of the first that was widely available, one of the first to be very successful. It was kind of an easy piece of tech to replicate based on the design of it. And so as a result, lots and lots of people just ripped off Namco's arcade board design and created their own GALAXIAN clone hardware. And you'd be surprised how many games you recognize showed up on GALAXIAN clone hardware in their original incarnation, such as Frogger here. Frogger actually began life running on the same board as GALAXIAN. Sega licensed that from Konami and released it in the US. You probably have seen Sega's name on Frogger at some point, possibly Gremlins, and that's because there was a lot of licensing involved with the GALAXIAN hardware games that they did. They also licensed Super Cobra from Konami, and for some reason it was very small, but they licensed the very annoying Moon Cresta from Nichibutsu. So that wasn't really a huge like a huge creative win necessarily for Sega, but it did really kind of, like I said, put them in line with what the rest of the industry was doing. It gave them connections to major hits like Frogger and Moon Cresta that really enhanced their bottom line and helped turn them into a powerhouse. But I would say the first truly Sega piece of arcade hardware that was ever created was the VCO object hardware. And I did write this down. That stands for Voltage Controlled Oscillators. Sega, if you look back at their arcade history, their console history, you think of them as innovators in creating 3D graphics. And that was something a lot of companies wanted to do, to create the impression of 3D space on a flat screen. And there were a lot of different techniques. Sega explored a lot of them. But the VCO object hardware, really kind of gave them their first taste of what would become their standard approach. If you're looking at this looks a lot like Pole Position. This is Turbo. And Pole Position, of course, looks a lot like Outrun. But the thing about Turbo is that it predates both Pole Position and Outrun by a few years. That was really Sega's kind of first, I think, standout incident where they created a game and people sat up and took notice. Turbo looked amazing. Coleco licensed it for release on the ColecoVision and were so impressed with it that they created an entire expansion module for the ColecoVision that was just a steering wheel called the Turbo Controller. So it was a big, big deal. And it really, I think kind of set the future for Sega and made them realize 3D, like we got to make this 3D thing work. And they dabbled in that idea even before they went into 8-bit microprocessor games. They licensed a game from NBC or whoever who owned Happy Days called Fonz. And it was a motorcycle racing game, but it had a very impressive scaling effect that was really pretty revolutionary for a 1975 arcade game. I don't think that game had Joni Shark jumping though. This is a game called, Subrock 3D. I believe it is a light gun game. I've never actually seen it in person, but I don't see any crosshairs on these, so I have to assume. This is another pretty big hit for them called Zoom 909. In America, it was called Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom. Another licensed game, and that showed up on ColecoVision, Coleco Adam, and really was a pretty stunning piece of technology if you played it back in the day. It just felt like everything was flying in your face, and that predates Atari's Star Wars by a couple of years. So people weren't used to a space shooter that felt that fast and just had things zooming out of the background to attack you. So this was made possible by the VCO object hardware again, and that was a pretty simple piece of hardware, a standard Zilog Z80 chip, but it used a special kind of dual chip approach to generating sprites that allowed those sprites to scale and shrink. And again, that was basically the future for Sega. But it wasn't the only attempt they made to create 3D graphics. There was also the G80 hardware, which, again, if you are familiar with Star Wars Arcade, this is Star Trek, which came a year or two before Star Wars Arcade. That was an attempt to basically take the old PC text-based Star Trek games, the freeware games from the 1970s, apply it to vector graphics in the style of asteroids, and tie it in with the recent Star Trek The Motion Picture. So it has you just flying through space, blowing up Klingons. The Organians are so angry about this, but that's how it went. Not exactly canon, but kind of a big hit at the time. And again, this was a year before Star Wars Arcade, which was just a standout arcade hit that everyone loved and played. And this kind of paved the way for that.
Entering sector 1.2.
Mr. Spock has gone through puberty there. This is called Eliminator, and it's kind of an asteroids-ish game that, again, makes use of the raster or the vector effects. But the G80 hardware didn't just do vector effects. It could also create raster graphics, sprites. In this game, 005, which is kind of an early take on the stealth genre. Sorry, that's a little loud. And then here you have kind of them combining the Maze Chase game with Rally X. We've got a map up at the top that you're building by collecting question marks, with a little bit of a Crystal Castles perspective in a game called Sindbad Mystery, which was also on the G80 hardware. So that was the company's second attempt at 2D graphics in the same space. The third was the ZAXXON hardware, which they created in collaboration with a company called Ikegami Tsushinki, who had previously made Donkey Kong and a bunch of other Nintendo arcade games until they had a falling out with Nintendo over Donkey Kong rights. So they teamed up with SEGA and made ZAXXON here, which was a mind-blowing experience. They also made basically isometric Donkey Kong as kind of a take that to Nintendo with Congo Bongo here. I don't think it's as good a game as Donkey Kong, but it still looked really, really cool. So those were kind of the three effects that they explored in terms of getting into 3D space. You had the scaling graphics, everything, just an image that gets bigger and smaller. You had the isometric graphics of the G80, or the ZAXXON hardware, and you had the vector effects to create kind of a pre-polygonal 3D on the G80 hardware. So they were really, exploring here and experimenting. But all these were based on the same general kind of 8-bit processor chipset. They just had different graphical capabilities, different co-processors to help give them different capabilities. SEGA also, being in their experimental phase, trying to stay with the times, they also dabbled in laserdiscs, which, it's a fun little corner of history, and by that I don't necessarily mean fun to play, just fun to look back at. This is a game called Astron Belt, which is kind of, it's basically like playing Zoom 909 over a movie playing in the background, and things just kind of like fly out and shoot you, and sometimes if you shoot the thing that's flying around, everything explodes and it jumps to the next encounter. Not a great game, but I have to imagine that if you played this in 1983, it would have been kind of cool to see. But they also teamed up with some other companies to create games for the Laserdisc system. This is called GP World, and there's kind of a fun like Mary Poppins animation effect to this with the real world, like someone, maybe it was Yu Suzuki, a famous racing fan. Someone actually went and filmed driving around a racetrack, and then they said, okay, let's draw some sprites over this. And it's an interesting approach. I don't think it's the right approach, but you have to respect them for trying. And for 1984, that was pretty impressive. So yeah, that was kind of the experiments they did in up through 1983 or so. But around the same time, they finally sort of landed on what would be sort of the backbone of their arcade work for the next few years, and that's System 1, and then to a lesser degree System 2. And even if you're not familiar with System 1, you've probably heard of System 16 or System 32. Those were obviously the 16-bit successors and 32-bit successors of the System 1 board. But this was kind of the beginning of a family that would run for a decade or so and would power some of Sega's most beloved and popular and successful games. This is not one of them. This is called Starjacker, which is a game I discovered when I was doing my tour through the complete SG-1000 library. It's sort of their take on Namco's Xevious. And it's interesting because you have 4 lives in this game, and you have them all at once. Those ships down in the bottom right corner, that's all your lives. And every one of them, as you're flying around, is vulnerable. So it's this really strange risk-reward system where you have 4 times as much firepower at the outset, but every time you take a hit, you lose a life, and also you lose some of your firepower. So at the end, you're just this sad little single ship flying around, barely able to damage anything. It's a weird choice. Power down system. That's kind of the opposite of why people play shooters, I think. They like to feel the empowerment. Look at the games like Gradius or something, where you just end up, or Darius, where you're just blasting missiles and lasers all around the screen. This is the opposite of that. But again, you have to respect them for trying. They did a lot of arcade adaptations of American computer games, such as Choplifter and Pitfall 2, and those also ran on System 1, and they really upgraded Choplifter for the arcade edition. This is a game called Flicky, which is one of the few sort of pre-Hang-On games that Sega really loves to embrace and explore. They released it on Genesis, like completely remade it. Flickies, the little birds you have to rescue, they show up in games like Gunstar Superheroes. Flicky was also on the Astro City Mini. So this is one of the first games that really has had lasting power for them. This is Sega Ninja. Actually, this is Ninja Princess, which was then given a gender swap for the US and called Sega Ninja, and you played as a guy, I think, named Joe. And, Wonder Boy by Westone made its debut on System 1 before showing up on Master System and lots of other platforms and becoming Hudson's Adventure Island and so forth. This is Teddy Boy Blues, which if you owned a Master System, you'd probably remember the little card that was being held by a person on the cover to say, hey, this is the card you're buying. That one's unique for not only having a pretty interesting play loop that kind of builds on Flicky with a sort of infinite looping space, but also for being maybe the first video game to have a licensed song by a pop idol in it. There was a Japanese pop idol up and coming. She ended up having like 2 hit songs. But right as she was on her ascent, Sega made a deal with her agent or talent company or something and said, hey, why don't we take this kind of retro doo-wop song, Teddy Boy Blues, and make it the linchpin of our video game. And so you got Teddy Boy Blues, which is it's a pretty fun game, and the little background music that plays in the Japanese version but not the American version because of music licensing rights is pretty good. From here, Sega kind of began shifting into 16-bit hardware. They, around the time that Teddy Boy came out, Hang-On came out in arcades, and Hangout changed everything, not just for Sega, but for video games. Hangout was revelatory. It was an amazing experience. It was a motorcycle racing game, sure, but it was a game that put you right onto the track. It had a low camera perspective. There was a ride-on cabinet option in Japan. I don't know if they released it here, but it was a red motorcycle that you sat on, and you steered and controlled the game by leaning your body. And everything was flying past with these impressive 16-bit scaling graphics that built on what they had established with the VCO object hardware. And it was just basically the point at which Sega said, this is us from now on. So, again, they kind of ignore and disregard everything that came before that. But they still continue to dabble in 8-bit spaces. And they released a few other hardware platforms throughout the rest of the 80s that no one knows about, featuring a bunch of games that weren't localized into the US, have never been adapted to consoles. So they're just kind of these weird little relics that, like leftovers of Sega's early days. The first is the GIGAS hardware, which is called that because it plays a game called GIGAS, which is actually just Arkanoid. They're not even shy about it. This is just straight Arkanoid. It also played a game called Free Kick, which is Arkanoid, but you're trying to hit a ball past soccer players. Which, I don't know, actually this looks pretty fun. I want to play it.
Me too.
And then the final pieces of 8-bit arcade hardware that Sega produced and released into arcades were actually adaptations of their home consoles, the SG-1000 and the Sega Master System. They didn't actually have a name for the SG-1000 hardware. It was pretty much just, here's an SG-1000 with arcade sticks. But the Master System adaptation was called System E and actually had some slight enhancements over the original hardware. But when you look at the games they put on the SG-1000 hardware in arcades, you can kind of understand. Like if you've seen SG-1000, it's pretty primitive. It's ColecoVision basically. It is ColecoVision. But Champion Boxing there had graphics that just exceeded what anyone thought that system could do. And they liked it so much apparently that they said, let's put it in arcades. Unfortunately, it was competing against Nintendo's Punch-Out, so I don't know how well it actually did. But that shows a lot of confidence in that game. It's also worth noting that I believe that was the first arcade games worked on by, or the first console games designed by Rieko Kodama, who is the artist, best known as the artist and is the director of Phantasy Star games, and Yu Suzuki, who is a big sports nut, would really kind of make his name with Outrun and a lot of those advanced racing games. But they got their start there with Champion Boxing. And you can kind of see the writing on the wall for the upward ascent of their careers when Sega said, hey, this console game, we have to put it in arcades. They also ported Doki Doki Penguin Land to arcades. It's a fun little puzzle platformer that is probably better known for its Master System incarnation, which looks a little better than this, but they got to start. So anyway, that's Sega's 8-bit arcade history, but at the same time they were moving into the console space, and they really looked to what they were doing in arcades and said, let's try to do this as closely as possible on home consoles as we make sort of an entrance. So their first console, the SG-1000, launched the exact same day as Nintendo's family computer in Japan, which would become the NES in America. And it did not compare technically to the NES. It looked, pretty paltry beside the NES, or the Famicom. But it still did well enough for them and succeeded for them to the point that they said, consoles are good, we should keep doing this. And that was sort of the beginning of the Master System, and then the Genesis. All those hardware platforms evolved from the SG-1000, not just in terms of conceptually, but in terms of actual hardware. The SG-1000 chip is still inside the Sega Genesis. So the SG-1000, they built the hardware around a spec very similar to the VIC Dual arcade hardware that we looked at at the very beginning of this panel. And it did a pretty good job of adapting some of those games into the home space. They also took the opportunity to take Monaco GP, their very final game made with transistor logic before they completely committed to switching to microprocessors, and made a pretty impressive rendition of it on the SG-1000. The SG-1000 had a few deficiencies compared to the Famicom. It could only create single-colored sprites as opposed to four-colored sprites, and it couldn't do per pixel scrolling, so it could only scroll 8 pixels at a time. So when you play a slow scrolling game, it gets a little headachy, but for a fast game like Monaco GP, it works out okay. This is their home adaptation of GP World, which I think actually looks more convincing than the Mary Poppins animated overlay on top of filmed racing tracks. It's a decent racer. They, of course, adapted System 1's Flicky to SG-1000. It had to visual downgrade, but it's convincing. It plays well. It really kind of captures the physics of the game, which are so essential because you're constantly jumping to evade enemies. This is Ninja Princess, and as you can see, it kind of suffers from the SG-1000's limitations in terms of scrolling. It doesn't scroll smoothly. It scrolls in these kind of like half-screen measures. So it's really, really hard to play that game and not be ambushed by something that's halfway up the screen that you couldn't see until you scrolled. But it does show their ambitions in bringing their arcade experiences home, even if they had to be a little compromised for the hardware. It was kind of a chance for them with the SG-1000 to create a home development team and start getting practice and experience, and they would carry that experience forward into their subsequent systems. As was the case for most consoles back in the mid-'80s, they also adapted a lot of computer games. Their version of Lode Runner is way more accurate to the Apple II version than Nintendo and Hudson's Bruderbund was. This is a game called Droll, another Bruderbund game, which is pretty much forgotten, but seems to have a lot of a special place in the hearts of Sega's creators. And then this is the first Japanese role-playing game made specifically for the Japanese market, the Black Onyx, which was made by Hank Rogers, who would go on to become famous for basically making Tetris happen all around the world. But before he did that, he did a Wizardry clone. And Sega put it out as the very final SG-1000 game. It's really punching above the weight class for that system, but it's impressive that they managed to do it at all. Not exciting to watch. And then you did have some original games that were pretty darn good on SG-1000. This is Yuji Naka's first game, Girl's Garden. He would go on to become famous for this blue hedgehog, I can't remember his name. In this game, you play as little girl in Violet, and she collects flowers. You have to be careful to collect fully grown flowers, not buds, and not wilted flowers, and get them to that boy who has his eyes on the girl in pink at the top right of the top indicator at the top of the screen. But if you give him enough flowers, then he's like, I'll never stray from you, my love, until the next stage when you have to pick more flowers for me. It's a terrible, terrible world she's into. But, the heart wants what it wants. But it's a fun little game, and this is one of the few SG-1000 games that Sega has republished from time to time. It showed up on the Japan-only final Sega Ages compilation for 3DS. So a little hard to get to, but I would love to see Sega go back and revisit some of these games and make them accessible, because this is a cute little platformer and cute little action game, and there are lots of similarly fun little games on this platform, even though it's pretty primitive looking, but still fun. This is Gulkov by Compile, the shooter masters. They managed to do things here with this game that the SG-1000 should not have been capable of. Like, remember, this was the ColecoVision under a different name, and I can't think of any ColecoVision game that I've seen that does this, at least not that was released contemporaneously. And this is one of the final games for SG-1000 called Loretta no Shozo, The Portrait of Loretta, Sherlock Holmes. And this is a murder mystery investigation graphic adventure built in the style of Portopio Renzoku Satsujin Jiken, which was a huge hit on Japanese computers and Famicom, and led the way to Dragon Quest and all of the cool adventure games that Spike Chunsoft has published, like 428 Shibuya Scramble. So this was Sega's take on that particular genre. And it's really impressive that they got that into an SG-1000 card. But in 1985, Sega turned the SG-1000 into the Mark III. It was called the Mark III because it was the third iteration of the SG-1000. It ran on the same processor, but the Mark III, aka the Master System in the US, had a supplemental graphic chip that could do this kind of thing with Phantasy Star's mazes. Like you saw the Black Onyx a minute ago. That was the same exact style of game as this. Those were released about 9 months apart. But the Mark III was so powerful, so much more powerful than the SG-1000, that it was able to create this smooth scrolling effect, much richer graphics. It had on cartridge saving as opposed to a password system. Just a much better game. And again, this was a collaboration between Rieko Kodama and Yuji Naka, who did the programming on the dungeon scenes and made it look so smooth and immersive. And the funny thing is, Phantasy Star 2 for Sega Genesis actually is kind of a visual step back from this game, just because Naka has said that if he had tried to program a similarly convincing scrolling effect on Sega Genesis, because of the higher resolution and higher graphical needs, it would have required too much storage capacity to fit onto the cartridge. So they just went to top-down dungeons. So it's one of the rare instances where an 8-bit game, especially an 8-bit RPG, kind of outclasses its sequel. But that was just Phantasy Star, and this was really kind of, the synthesis of all the skills and all the experience that Sega's home development team had cultivated by working on SG-1000. And then this is Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap. Again, if you are from Europe, you love this game so much. You've probably seen The Dragon's Trap for modern consoles, and that was an act of love by someone who grew up playing this game and just said, I'm going to break this game apart, disassemble it, and rebuild it for new systems. I want to understand everything about it, and it really shows. It's just, Sega's work is the kind of work that just inspires that kind of devotion and love among its fans. Speaking of fans, like I said, a lot of them are based in Brazil, and that's because Brazil has some really strange import laws for electronics. And when companies try to export their systems or take their systems into Brazil, there were these restrictions where if the game system wasn't made in Brazil, they put this massive tax on it, like an 80% tax or something. It's just unbelievably huge. So that made Nintendo systems and Atari systems and so on and so forth really expensive. But Sega had the bright idea, why don't we team up with a Brazilian company, they picked Tectoy as their partners, to manufacture our hardware for us here in Brazil. So we get around that tariff and we can sell our games and systems to the Brazilian audience for a reasonable price. And as a result of that, the Master System is still being sold in Brazil through Tectoy. They still manufacture new Master System hardware and sell games for it. So that means that looking back to the beginning of this 8-bit journey, in 1976, Sega has been in the 8-bit hardware business for nearly 50 years. That is a record in the games industry. No one else has had that kind of steadfastness with consoles. Although technically Sega got out of the console business about 20 years ago, somehow they're still making 8-bit machines through Tectoy. And this is one of the games that was modified for the Brazilian audience by Sega. You might recognize it as a Wonder Boy game. It's called Monica, and it's based on a Brazilian cartoon. So, they adapted a lot of their content, or Tectoy adapted a lot of the content, specifically for the Brazilian audience. And as a result, you have this very long-lasting legacy of 8-bit game design. And as you can hopefully see, the things you looked at and heard about during this presentation clearly paved the way for Sega's evolution into the 16-bit arcade space with superscalar systems, into Genesis. Like I said, the Genesis, like the Master System, built on the hardware that had come before it. And that's that none of that would be possible without the work that Sega did in the 70s and 80s, playing around with the Zilog Z80 and other assorted systems. Anyway, that's the entirety of my presentation. If you enjoyed it, I have a comprehensive book on the Sega SG-1000 coming out next summer, hopefully right in time for the 40th anniversary of the system. It is going to be 420 pages long and cover every single game in the SG-1000 library in pretty comprehensive depth. And I will also be jumping into creating videos about the chronology of Master System releases in the US pretty early in 2023, and taking that all the way up to Phantasy Star and beyond. So there will be lots of Sega entertainment to entertain you.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, everyone.
Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and to the right are the playlist of the Portland Retro 2022 and some other interesting videos. Thank you.